reserved. But one of the good things I was thinking about as it rolled on was that life, when it changes in so many ways. And I listened to that stuff about The Guardian, for example. I occasionally used to say, forgive them their press passes, but now I'm on very good terms with The Guardian. Ironically, that Alan Rusbridger, the editor, has become a really good friend. We've been campaigning together for things to do in Oxford. So life rolls on in unexpected ways. Now, of course, I'm honoured to be speaking at this meeting, this revival, I think, of the recovery course. If this was show business, I think I'd be called the warm-up man. And that's perhaps not a bad label, because I think what we are in effect doing today is rewarming, reheating, and relaunching a recovery course which has had such huge success in the past in changing lives and rescuing careers and restoring confidence and saving literally thousands of people who were at a time in their lives on the downhill road towards being ruined by the tyranny of addiction. Now, a good starting point today, for me and for many of you, I think, is to recognize that really this is something we are all in together. Because the margin between sinking into a life which has become a shipwreck because of addiction, or sailing on towards a life which is fulfilled and successful and rebuilt, the margin between those two is often a very, very narrow and thin one. And although in later sessions of today we may well get into narrow areas of addiction, such as cocaine addiction or gambling addiction or whatever addiction, none of us should be in the business of casting the first stone, because many of us might admit in our quiet private moments that we all need to be recovering from something. When I first attended as a visitor a recovery course meeting at HDB approximately 13 or 14 years ago, I remember being struck by how the course leader, then as today, Nigel, and I'm going to get my revenge by saying quite a lot about him in a moment, how he began talking to his audience as a group who shared so much in common, so many common faults, failings, and weaknesses. And after establishing this common ground, he then broke the participants up into separate groups who had their own separate problems, such as addiction or to smoking or alcohol or sex or any number of choices from a huge smorgasbord of potential addictions. And so a starting point today, many of us probably admit that at various times in our lives we have needed to recover from something. In my own flawed, failed, and yet ultimately happily fulfilled life, I think I can point to my own need to recover from one or two problems which were certainly at the time never publicly identified as addictions. For example, like many a politician, I went through a period of being addicted to seeking fame in the media, or then keeping super fit by running far too many marathons, or chasing the illusion of power through political ambition. I could go on, but my list would be far more embarrassing. So if we're all in it together, or if we've all been in it together, in this spirit of togetherness, it does seem a thoroughly worthwhile endeavor today to be working together to get the recovery course relaunched. And that's because some of us in this audience, and I see many old friends and faces as well as new ones today, in the spirit of togetherness, it seems a thoroughly worthwhile endeavor to try and get the recovery course relaunched. And that's because so many of us know what a spectacular success story it used to be before COVID and other problems derailed it. Now, before I talk about this relaunch, which I hope will put the recovery course back on this map, or help to do so, I want to say a few words in a contrary direction about what the recovery course is not about, because I'm sure there's some newcomers here who've hardly heard of it. It is not about quick fixes. It's not about instant conversions. It's not about sudden miracles. From what I know of it, the recovery course is intensely practical, requiring a lot of hard work, hard graft, strong commitment, and it's light years removed from the worlds of magic or mysticism. The recovery course is not a church course, although churches very often host it. It is not a proselytizing course. There's no need to be a Christian or any kind of believer to do this course, although it should in passing be noted, and noted strongly, that the original authors of the 12 steps, which are central to the course, those founders were strong in their Christian faith, and their spirit still hovers over the recovery course today. Now, without even Nigel's introduction, you'll have noticed that I'm now, my dog collar, an ordained Christian priest. So, of course, in my own life's journey, I've come to believe strongly in the higher power, referred to several times in the original 12 steps of the Alcoholics course originally. But at the same time, I'm sure that the recent amendments to the wording of the 12 steps, which refer to something like God, whoever you imagine him to be, is a verbal dilution of no consequence whatever. God himself is surely big enough not to be bothered by such semantics. But I know from my own observation and knowledge of the recovery course, I know that all sorts of conditions of atheists, agnostics, and country members of the anti-God squad end up, to their considerable surprise, finding God or being found by God during the course. But instead of talking about God, let me focus for a moment on a God-related subject, grace. Now, grace is a word with a stoop in it. Anyone doing the recovery course or thinking they might need to be on the recovery course knows that they have fallen, and often fallen low, and they need to be helped by friends and by structures and by disciplines, friends who will stoop low with them and give them a compassionate hand and pull them away from addiction and into the grace-filled state of a life free of addiction. And one hero of mine who made this journey some 200 years ago with spectacular success was called John Newton. He had an original addiction. He was addicted to the slave trade. He was a highly successful slave trader in West Africa, and he was also an extremely able and capable slave ship captain. He made in the 1750s 3 voyages to West Africa, and he indulged in all the horrors, the cruelties, the lusts, and the bestialities of that trade. But he came by his own route to recognize that a higher power than his own will was needed in his life to change direction. And he did. And he acknowledged this in the compelling and almost immortal words of the hymn he wrote for his small country parish congregation in Bedfordshire, the song which is now more performed than any other song in the world apart from Happy Birthday, Amazing Grace. If you go to America these days, as I was recently, as Nigel said, I think I must have heard Amazing Grace sung something like 16 times, some of it in churches, but at weddings, funerals, television. It's a song which has run around the world and into history. And of course many of you will know it, but perhaps its most poignant verse is this one. Through many dangers, toils and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace has brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. Now when Newton had conquered his addiction to the riches and the rewards of the slave trade, like many an ex-addict, he decided he wanted to try and do some good, to put something back into the pot for having been rescued, for being a wretch like me, as he described himself. And so he became a priest, a preacher, a hymn writer, but far and away the most important and under-recognized achievement in his life was that he became William Wilberforce's right-hand man in the campaign to bring about the abolition of slavery. Let me digress for a moment to tell you this largely unknown story of how this happened. Newton was promoted or preferred in the Church of England, for which he was, I may say, barred for some considerable time when he was a candidate for ordination for having, quote unquote, too much enthusiasm. And this actually meant being in tune with the Methodists at the time, but still, that was the spirit of the ordination at the time. Anyway, he became in due course a vicar of a church only a few hundred yards from here, St. Mary Woolnoth. And he was a marvellous preacher. The first time he ever preached, the congregation absolutely swayed, and a rather over-enthusiastic parishioner rushed up to him. In fact, he fell at his feet and said, "Oh, Mr. Newton, that was the most brilliant and moving sermon I've ever heard." And Newton said, "Thank you, my dear sir. The devil told me that himself a few moments ago." I keep that in mind if ever I think I'm doing well as a bishop. Anyway, Newton was at a Sunday evening service, and he came back from the service into his vestry, and he found a mysterious note, almost worthy of John le Carré. And it was a request from a man he'd last seen in the man's childhood. But he was an MP, not a very impressive MP, I might say, at the time, William Wilberforce. And it said, "My dear sir, I wish to meet you, but it must be in complete secrecy. Please don't tell anyone I've asked for this. How can we meet confidentially?" Anyway, this was William Wilberforce, who everyone thinks of now as a wonderful success story, which of course he was. But at the time, he was regarded as a political lightweight. He was in Parliament. He was much more well regarded as a gambler in the St. James's clubs than he was as an MP. But he had connections. He was a friend of William Foote. He was charming. He'd bribed his way to no small extent into Parliament with the electors. But anyway, he got there. And suddenly he'd had, for various reasons, a change of direction. And he came to see Newton to say, I feel very ashamed of my life in politics. I want to join the church. I met Newton, who was in this vicarage in a place called Charles Square. Wilberforce walked 3 times around the square to make sure no one was seeing him come into the church. That was because respectable members of Parliament were not thought to be right to associate with what were called gospel preachers, dangerous people, we would call evangelicals. But anyway, in he goes, and Newton gives him wonderful advice. He says, look, stay where you are, don't think of resigning from Parliament, stay and do God's work, and anything I can do to help you, I will, because I hear you're interested, and have made at least one speech about ending the slave trade. What is not known, I've written a biography of Newton, which is why I'm talking about him, but interestingly, Newton then developed into Wilberforce's right-hand man in a vital way. First of all, Wilberforce was not all that strong a character. When he was getting the campaign going, he sort of collapsed mentally and physically, and Newton was the one who prayed with him and kept him going, which was no small achievement. But even more important than that, because Newton had been through it, call him an addict, call him a sinner, whatever you like, but Newton was the most wonderful eyewitness of the slave trade. No other eyewitness of slave trade was ever prepared to put his head above the parapet and say, I know all about it because I did it. But Newton did, and he was the most compelling witness. And some of you, I'm sure, give testimonies every so often. Never underestimate the value of a personal testimony. And in Newton's case, he gave personal testimony to the House of Commons, to the Cabinet, who stood up and applauded him, and the Prime Minister escorted him out of the room. He read a pamphlet called Thoughts on the African Slave Trade. And gradually, it wasn't only Wilberforce, it wasn't only Newton, but it's fair to say that without Wilberforce, there wouldn't have been abolition of the slave trade, but without Newton, there would have been no William Wilberforce. So he was absolutely pivotal. He recovered from his bad times, his addiction, and played a vital role. And Newton, although he got old and tired, he lived long enough to see the slave trade abolished. It was in 1807 it got the royal assent. And Newton was dying. He didn't actually die until December that year. There were obviously tabloid reporters around at that time, because one of them, when Newton was on his deathbed, somehow got into the bedroom and said, "Any last words, Mr. Newton?" And Newton produced what I think was one of the greatest last words in the history of epitaphs. He said, "Sir, I know only two things. I am a great sinner, but Christ is a great Saviour." What an exit line. It was said at that time of Wilberforce, one man with passion makes a majority. And that's as true then in the 18th century as it is true today. And this gives me the chance to take my revenge in introductions and say something about Nigel Skelton. Now, as many as you know, of course, he was the founder of the original recovery course. But the story of how he came and became its founder is, to me, a rather fascinating one. I know that Nigel was the star of what used to be the epicenter of the print journalism newspaper industry, then called Fleet Street. And I knew about him long before I met him, because I too worked in Fleet Street for many years in the much humbler capacity of a reporter and feature writer. But Nigel was a far more important Fleet Streeter than me, and indeed became a legend because he was the picture editor of the Sunday Telegraph. Now, I remember old Fleet Street pretty well, and in the fiercely competitive dog-eat-dog infighting between the papers about getting the best photograph of the day, today's picture, into the paper, Nigel really was top dog. He was the Sunday Telegraph's picture editor for over 17 turbulent, action-packed years. And because he was a force of nature in the world of scoops, exclusives, hold the front page, photo dramas, he lived, to put it mildly, an extremely stressful life. If there had been a recovery force available for Fleet Street excitement junkies, Nigel would have been a prime candidate for doing the course. But perhaps realizing that stress was getting a bit much for him, Nigel, at the height of his Fleet Street fame, retired from the fray, and he made plans to start a quieter life. I think this may have been a misjudgment, in the prison service. But a funny thing happened to Nigel on his way to his first prison. By coincidence, or was it God instance, he met Paul Cowley, who was then the HGB curate in charge of the World's End estate, where there were many residents troubled by addiction problems. And so Nigel was somehow persuaded to write the first ever draft of the recovery course, around the 12-step program, but with all sorts of original Nigel developments, initiatives, bells and whistles, and so on. And the first recovery, which was held on the World's End estate in 2007, did not get exactly off to a flying start. It was attended only by 8 ladies. And gradually this number increased from 8 to 16, 16 to 24, and then the course moved to Holy Trinity Brompton with a starting number of 48 people. And then within a year or two, HGB and its various offshoots was running 3 or 4 courses a year with 120 people per course participating. And so for the second time in his life, Nigel started to become a legend. Having been a Fleet Street legend, he became a recovery course legend. And I think there are probably plenty of you in this audience today who can bear witness to the impact the recovery course had on their lives and on their organizations or on their churches. One person today who's certainly going to tell a story of an important part of the recovery course is my close friend and colleague, the Reverend Jo Davies, sitting there. She is the managing chaplain of HMP Pentonville, a big job, and she is in fact my boss, and I'm one of her chaplains. Jo can tell you much better than I can about the huge and amazing impact that the recovery course made on some of Pentonville's most difficult and impossible prisoners. And she'll also tell you something, I think, about our plans at Pentonville to bring back the recovery course in the prison in the near future. Now I'm going to end by suggesting that those words, bring back the recovery course, should be the mantra for this conference today. Not just in the prisons, important though they are. Let's face it, prisoners of addiction are to be found everywhere. High earners, high achievers, hedge fund success, masters of the universe, as they call themselves, right down to lowest of the low, broken lives, broken marriages, bankrupts, divorcees, prisoners, and so on. I know about some of these dramas myself. I sometimes tell people that I went through the ensuing agonies of defeat, disgrace, divorce, bankruptcy, and jail. Quite a royal flush of crises by anybody's standards. But I know, therefore, the kind of trajectory that those who get into trouble with addiction can have to go through. But the great news which is going to be developed in this conference today is that with help from the higher power and from other helpers, one can recover from them all. Let me end by returning to the analogy of wrecks and shipwrecks and recovering or being rescued from them. I was an MP for 24 years. My constituents were called Thanet, but actually that means a geographical stretch of the Kent coast which roughly encompasses the White Cliffs of Dover. And it runs from Dover through a number of interesting lifeboat stations, Dover, Walmer, Deal, Ramsgate, and I can't tell you how many RNLI dinners I went to in the course of my life as a constituency MP. And I always remember one particular story, which is a historical story, but is valid today in many situations. And the story was that one of the lifeboats, I think it was the Walmer lifeboat, had an experienced coxswain, an experienced crew, and they realized from rocket flares that there was a ship on the nearby Goodwin Sounds, which was in terrible trouble, wrecked and sinking, as many ships were in the 18th and 19th century on that treacherous sandbank. And it was a rough night, a really stormy night, and the crew looked out on the sort of tempestuous waves and didn't want to go. And they said, look, we know, we're quite experienced, we know all these things, we probably could get out, but we'll never get back in this weather. And the coxswain rallied the lifeboat crew with the immortal words, "We have to get out, we don't have to get back." And out went the lifeboat, rescued the crew and so on. It was a great success. I think perhaps what this conference is all about is relaunching. I don't suppose the lifeboat crew said, well, relaunching, we said, well, launching. But there will be qualms, there will be negatives, there will be doubts. And I think my last words are, we have to relaunch. There'll be difficulties, there'll be problems. It ain't going to be easy. But we will get back, and we'll save a great many lives in the process. Thank you.